Good evening and welcome to Q&A live from the Casula Powerhouse Arts Centre. And joining us tonight, an audience of 300 from southwestern Sydney. And to answer their questions, Shadow Immigration Minister Scott Morrison, legendary AFL player and coach Kevin Sheedy, who's now trying to bring his own brand of footy into Western Sydney, UN Youth Representative and local youth activist Summer Hadid, lawyer and local boy made good Heath Ducker, former journalist and Sex Discrimination Commissioner, now Liberal State MP Prue Goward, and the Financial Services Minister and member for nearby Prospect, Chris Bowen. Please welcome our panel. Well, Q&A is live from 9:35 Eastern Time, so if you have a question, send it by SMS 1975522 or via our website at abc.net.au/Q&A Quanda. And you can join the Twitter conversation through #Quanda, and we'll be showing a selection of your tweets on the screen. So let's get the discussion going with our very first question tonight, and it comes from Andrew Walker.
Where did Kevin 07 go? Why would anyone vote for him now when Kevin 10's not anywhere near the same person he was 3 years ago?
Heath Ducker, let's start with you, Heath, and first of all, whether you agree with that proposition.
Yeah, I think that Kevin appears to have lost his way a bit, but I think it's largely a failure of being able to communicate his policies to the public, to the voting public. That's
a bit of a problem, isn't it, for a Prime Minister?
well, it is, but he's been a bureaucrat in the past. He's got that history behind him. He doesn't seem to realise that being a politician is not just about speaking on an intellectual level, but speaking on a heart level to his voters and his public. Now, he's got a lot of policy issues. He's shown himself at risk of being judged as being not committed to things he said in the past. He's at risk of being seen as being able to jettison his own policies and not stand by what he believes in. And I think the voters are beginning to see that, and they haven't completely lost faith in him, but they want to know that he's worth their belief.
Summer Hadid.
Well, I'd say that it's not only a communication problem, it's one of conviction. 3 years ago, young people voted overwhelmingly for Kevin Rudd because they wanted change on climate change. They wanted a more humane approach on refugee and asylum seeker policy. Kevin Rudd promised this, but he's failed to deliver on those fronts. Only last week we saw someone like Petro Georgiou stand up in Parliament and talk about his convictions, talk about his principles, and he based his actions in Parliament around those convictions. So it wasn't just about rhetoric for him, it was also about action. We're not seeing that with Kevin Rudd, and young people are turning to other parties like the Greens accordingly.
Let's hear from Kevin Sheedy. What do you think about that proposition? And is it getting tougher these days to be known as Kevin?
Well, look, I think that the one thing I tend to feel that people forget is that Kevin Rudd has taken us through a global economic area that we feel like we haven't been touched in Australia. I don't think we've appreciated what this government actually has done in regard to keeping us away from what's happened to most of the rest of the world. So I don't think he's got very many ticks on that at all. So I'll be voting for Kevin next, so away you go.
Scott Morrison.
Look, I think Kevin 07, I quite like this Kevin 10, but Kevin 07 is a bit like Elvis. He's left the building. We haven't seen him since. But the serious point about this is that prior to the last election, Kevin Rudd went out there and I think willingly led people to believe certain things about him. He knowingly raised expectations, and I don't think it's unreasonable that he now be held to account against those expectations. It was almost like the sun would shine brighter, the nights would be cooler, and he really allowed people to believe something very significant about him, which he hasn't lived up to. So he is basically reaping what he's sown himself.
Let's go right across to the government here from Chris Bowen. What happened to Kevin 07? Does he still exist?
Well, look, we came to office with a big agenda, an ambitious agenda, and I think that we've done a good, solid job at meeting that agenda. And when you look at what we said we'd do, we said we'd abolish work choices, we've abolished work choices. We said we'd embark on health reform, we've embarked on health reform. We said we'd do something about cost of living. We've increased the age pension. We've increased the childcare rebate. We've done a range of things. Now, have we done everything we set out to do? Of course not. We haven't done that. We clearly acknowledge that. And people are giving that... And people have given us a message about that in recent weeks, and we get that message. But I think, in fairness, as Kevin said, we've also been dealing with the biggest economic downturn in 75 years, and we've also had to deal with that as we go. So we've been a good, solid government, but every government goes through in their first term expectation issues. Every government in their first term, particularly when they've defeated a long-standing government and there's a lot of pent-up frustration in the community, a lot of hopes riding on you, you go through in your first term these sorts of issues. Most governments do, and most governments in their first term have trouble getting back. Most first elections are very difficult. Was for John Howard, was for Bob Hawke, just traditionally is, and I think we're going through that now.
And I would say he's the Wizard of Oz. I mean, he was a man who stood behind pretentious rhetoric, but a very young, appealing rhetoric. We'd never seen a Prime Minister or a Prime Ministerial candidate who smiled as much, and really there never was much, sadly, behind Kevin Rudd, and the tests of the age, and we have had a number of challenges in this last 3 years. He just hasn't been able to step up to the mark.
Chris Bowen, just answer those points made by Sam Hadid and now by Prue Goward, that Kevin Rudd, for example, set out the greatest moral challenge of our time as climate change, when it became politically inconvenient, dropped it.
Well, no, I'll deal with both issues. Firstly, there was asylum seekers. Some have said we hadn't instituted a new system, a more compassionate system. I would disagree. We clearly have, in my view. On climate change, well, I think Scott would agree that we've made some changes as well. I think Scott would agree that there's been changes made. And secondly, on climate change...
Not big changes, but anyway.
On climate change, I don't think anybody could argue that all through last year we weren't out there arguing the case. We went to the election with an emissions trading scheme as our policy, so did the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party assassinated their leader to get rid of that policy. And then we were arguing at Copenhagen and elsewhere as strongly as anybody could that we needed to do this. Now, we've accepted the political reality that this is not going to happen in the Senate, that we simply can't get this through, and therefore we've had to delay our plans. But the commitment to action on climate change doesn't change. I mean, we've got the biggest renewable energy program in the nation's history. We're building the biggest solar plant in the world, in Australia. I mean, we're just getting on with the job.
Okay, I'm just going to get Sam Hadid to respond to that, because she raised it in the first place. I mean, do you hear what the government is saying here? Do you accept it?
Absolutely not. I mean, your leader and your government, time after time, reinforce this idea that climate change is the greatest moral challenge of our time. And then at the first point of political challenge, you just dropped it. I mean, you could have pulled the double dissolution trigger. You could have taken it to the people. Why haven't you?
Well,
can I propose one possible answer? Is it because you couldn't possibly have two great big taxes running simultaneously in an election campaign?
You're stealing my lines.
Well, I don't think, in fairness, Summer, you can say that the first political opportunity we dropped it. I mean, this was argued vociferously all through last year at great political cost to the government, and we continue to argue it, and we'll continue to argue that an emissions trading scheme is necessary for Australia, but we accepted the reality that it's not going to happen on the time frame that we wanted it to happen. That the Liberal Party has embarked on a massive scare campaign on this and will oppose it in the Senate, and so will the Greens.
But
and
Chris,
so will the Greens oppose it in the Senate.
Chris, the point is you can take it to a double dissolution. You know that. Last year, yeah, we had a very big discussion about this within the coalition, and it was a tumultuous period for it. But our position on that is crystal clear. If you believe you should introduce an ETS, take it to a double. You can do it.
Now, we went to the last election proposing an ETS, as did you, Scott, and you walked away from it.
You can take it to a double, Chris, you know that. Well, you have the trigger, pull it.
We'll conduct the next election on climate change, on health, on work choices, on a range of issues.
Okay, we actually have a web question that's come in. It's from Marta Balan. If Rudd's popularity continues to go down, does the Labor Party have a plan B for the next election? Chris Bowen.
Certainly not. And can I say, I mean, we need to keep this in perspective. Kevin had stratospheric levels of popularity ratings which are unheard of for a Prime Minister over such a long period of time. He's now returned to more normal levels. Even on today's opinion poll...
you wouldn't like to regard them as normal levels, would you? Because you'd lose the election if they're normal.
But on the question... well, sure. No, on one opinion poll out today we would lose, clearly. On another opinion poll out today we'd narrowly win, and this is going to be tight. But The question was about the Prime Minister's popularity. The Prime Minister is preferred Prime Minister by 10 points. Now, that is a pretty solid result when you compare it to, say, how John Howard was over Mark Latham. Kevin Rudd was preferred over John Howard by similar levels. It's about the standard level for support for a Prime Minister over a Leader of the Opposition. It's not stratospheric. No, clearly it is. I'm sorry, it is. It's about standard. As I say, I mean, the election which John Howard won quite comfortably over Mark Latham, his level as preferred Prime Minister was at similar points in the cycle.
But you know the question everyone's asking themselves, would the Labor Party do a lot better with Julia Gillard as Prime Minister now? And bear in mind the Japanese just dropped their Prime Minister because his polls were doing badly and put in another one.
The Japanese political system's a lot different to ours.
That's true.
You don't base your decisions on one opinion poll or one bad few months. You base it on who's the best person for the job. Kevin Rudd is clearly the best person to be Prime Minister of Australia.
And the real point is that the first term of John Howard, we would not be having this discussion. He was still up there. The first term of this government, and we're having a very serious discussion about losing.
You're rewriting history. You lost 8 ministers in scandals in your first term.
That is not this discussion. That is not this discussion.
And prove. On the popular vote, we won the 1998 election with 51% of the vote. You're rewriting history very conveniently.
No, you are misrepresenting history.
We won 20 seats after your first term and came very close to winning the election. So you're just airbrushing the whole first term of the Howard government.
There was no
Okay, all right, I'm not going to let us
discussion
dwell too long on history. You're watching Q&A. We're live, not back in 1996. Live from the Casula Powerhouse. The next question comes from Antonius Kaldos.
Why do politicians have to be sneaky and tricky? Does politics have to be so political?
Are you, while I've got the microphone there, are you talking about politics on both sides?
Yes.
Let's go to Kevin Sheedy.
Thank you.
Well, do you have the impression that political leaders are sneaky?
Look, I've enjoyed living in Australia, the Prime Ministers I've had in my lifetime. I've watched and challenged some of the policies of both parties and what's been put on the table. I've enjoyed the debates right around the whole country. Personally, look, some people are sneaky, but they're sneaky in all walks of life. You know when you meet somebody really good. I think that, look, I would think that it's hard to find a Prime Minister just within 3 years. I think we rush. We just are so critical at times. I would give this person one more look, and that's how I think about making decisions. And, you know, coaches are selectors. We have to face the audience like any other person. And if you think it's not political in football, I can tell you it is. The deal in the end is I would look at this guy another term, and if he's not great enough then you move him on. That's my opinion.
Let's hear from Heath. Yeah, why is it we're hearing this sort of, you know, quite widespread disaffection with politicians? You're seeing it in the polls too, a move to third parties, the Greens and many others in the latest poll as well, independents.
Well, I think Kevin Rudd's a good example of a politician who is conflating policy and politics too much. And I think you've got to walk a fine line. We as Australians and people want to see that we've got a real person in politics, a real person to represent us. And in 2007, Kevin Rudd provided that. He was a sort of a pre-Obama change agent, and we had that belief in him. But as time's gone by, he seems to have put a spin and politicised everything, and we're beginning to see through that. And I think there's a real desire in the Australian public to see someone more real, someone who can stand up and be someone we can trust and someone we can relate to and identify with. And Obama is a good example of that in America. We don't tend to have politicians like that here in Australia.
Can I answer that? Because that...
Well, actually, you can. Go ahead, Prue.
Well, it was a question about politicians, and I think the level of scrutiny of politicians is unlike the scrutiny of any other profession in the country, and I'm sure this is something we might all agree on. And the more you scrutinise anybody, the worse they're going to look. The more you get into their allowances and what they do on their weekends and who they look at twice, the more you're going to find something wanting. And I think that the scrutiny drives dissent and drives disillusionment with politicians. I don't know what the answer is because it's your money and we're your leaders and you expect high levels of behaviour. But I do think that inevitably when you scrutinise Jesus Christ wouldn't have always passed.
Summer Hadid.
Oh, I think he would have, personally.
Not always, not always.
I'll vote for Jesus.
I'm voting. Yep, I'm on.
Well, I think politics should be about people. And if people are dissatisfied well, surely that says something about the politician themselves. You know, when I look to politicians and political leaders, I look for a strong character. I look for someone who is going to fight for my rights, is going to fight for something they believe in as well. We're lacking that in our political landscape, and that's where the dissatisfaction is coming from, I believe.
Yeah, I don't think it's got just to do with the scrutiny argument. I mean, we as people know that people have flaws, and we're willing to accept them. It's just that they've got to come out and be honest about them, and be the full person.
I think that's a good point. I mean, politics is a tough business. I mean, Chris and I will debate tonight, and Prue and so on with Chris, but at the end of the day, it's a tough business, and that's the nature of it. But one of the things I think a lot of people don't see is the work that goes on between politicians behind the scenes. I mean, probably the most significant thing that I felt great to be part of in this current term of Parliament was something Chris was involved with as well, and that was when we walked the Kokoda Trail just over a year ago, taking young people from my community in the Sutherland Shire. Jason Clare, member for Blaxland, and Chris was helping him out, raising some funds, took some young Muslim kids from Bankstown, and we did the trek together. It wasn't, you know, we got a bit of a profile and media that focused on that and what we're trying to achieve with that. But look, I think politicians just have to be themselves, and that's the point I think you're making, Heath. You've got to be authentic. None of us are perfect. I think we're all there for the right purpose.
It's quite interesting, isn't it, that you do get bipartisanship on this one issue, that politicians aren't all bad. But we didn't hear from Chris Bowen, and I'd just like to I mean, this issue of genuineness, which keeps coming up, is a key one. And a perfect example today, actually, you get a bad poll, and it's absolutely clear that every one of your ministers who's come out and commented on it have exactly the same line given to them on evidently on a cue card. You know, this is all about Tony Abbott. He's going to become the Prime Minister. You better be careful. Every single person said exactly the same thing. Sooner or later, the public starts to see through this obvious subterfuge, don't they?
Well, I actually agree with Prue and Scott. I think that politicians, of course, is never going to be a popular vocation in terms of that test. But the vast majority of politicians on both sides want to do the right thing for the country. We have different ways of getting there. We have different ideas about what we should be doing. But we both, all of us, with very, very few exceptions, want the right thing for the country. Now, people, I understand, are cynical about politics, cynical about spin. One person's spin is another person's emphasis. It's just a different way of looking at things.
Do you get little cue cards on the day the bad poll comes out?
No, I don't get cue cards, no.
How do you all know to say exactly the same thing? Well, honestly, how do you actually know, each of you, spontaneously, to say exactly the same thing, one after the other?
Well, I don't think we always do. And when we don't, people like you, Tony, with all due respect, leap on any thing that one minister said slightly different to another minister as a great sign of government disunity. So, of course, you're going to find ministers trying to say similar things, because if we don't, then people like you will be doing your job and pointing out that we've said something a bit different to each other.
Well, I'm pointing out now that you're all saying exactly the same thing, and it's spontaneously happened.
It's immaculate intellectual conception.
It is. It's kind of hard. Let's move on. Remember, you're watching Q&A, the program where you ask the questions. Our next question comes from in the audience. In Casula, it's from Felicity Chu.
Hi. I was a Liberal Party voter and have recently decided that Labor is the lesser of two evils. What advice could you give to sway other voters like me back to the Liberal Party when Tony Abbott wants to cut services such as broadband, health and education, and is opposed to taxes that are going to pay for the services that the Australian community has asked for?
Scott Morrison, you better take that.
Well, what we've seen from this government is a classic Labor government of tax and spend. And what's the alternative to big taxes and big spending? Well, it's not taxing as much and not spending as much. This government inherited a very, very clean set of books. They had no debt. In fact, they had a surplus in the bank sitting there. It's all gone, and we're now significantly in debt. In fact, we're borrowing $100 million a day under this government. It's our view that that's way too much. that actually putting our future in hock in this way is going to be in the long-term disadvantage of this country. And so, look, it may not be popular when we say we're not going to spend on this and spend on that and raise expectations here and there, as Kevin Rudd did before the last election, because if we're elected at the next election, we don't want to be sitting here 3 years from now facing the accusations that have come tonight that you said you'd do this and now you've done something different. So the Prime Minister, I don't think, can be taken on his promises this time, because last time he made them and we've all seen what's happened with them. So what you're getting from us is a very authentic and real assessment of what's happening out there in the Australian economy and what is necessary. But not all of it can be paid for, and by continuing to tax and spend the way this government is doing, then it really erodes our long-term economy.
Let's hear from Chris Bowen on that. We'll move on.
Well, you talked about spin, and we just had a good example of it. We had to do what we had to do, and we were faced with the biggest global financial crisis in 75 years, and that meant stimulating the economy. Now, we could have done what you wanted to do and not stimulate the economy, and you would have seen unemployment go up, and you would have seen, actually, the deficit be higher for longer, because you would have had higher unemployment, you would have seen more government expenditure on unemployment and less tax revenue. Now, we did what we had to do, and as a result, we now didn't go into recession. We have the strongest performing economy of any major economy in the world, and we're coming out of deficit and going into surplus before any other.
You'll never be in debt. You'll never be in surplus.
And Felicity, I'll do you a deal. Vote Liberal in New South Wales.
Oh, Prue, that was so... You just can't do that. I'm going to just go to another question. OK, let's go to our next question. It comes from Andrew Bars.
Yeah, I live in the electorate of Cook in Scott's electorate. Up until the last parliament, I was able to vote for Bruce Baird, who supported Petro Georgiou's views on asylum seeker policy. Now I've got a choice between Labor's tough but fair policy or Scott Morrison's back to the future tough policy. I'm looking for a compassionate and just policy. Who do you suggest I should vote for now?
Summer Hadid.
I say vote for the Greens. That's what I say. This is a really, really frustrating point in time. You know, we went through the Tampa crisis in 2001. We've been through that debacle, and yet politically we haven't moved forward on asylum seekers and refugee policy. There seems to be quite a disingenuous, I feel, communication from the opposition and from the government when it comes to refugee and asylum seeker policy. You know, suddenly we have a crisis over our borders, and we're losing control of our borders. Let's put things into perspective here. Asylum seekers account for less than 7% of our overall immigration intake. 90% of asylum seekers are actually found to be genuine refugees. This runs contrary, to the government's communication on this particular issue and the opposition's. I really am frustrated and really quite disgusted that we haven't moved forward.
Let's hear from Heath Ducker. And Heath, I've got to say, if you begin your answer by saying vote for X, I'll be really disappointed.
I know. Look, I agree with Summer on this. I think that, look, there is a feeling out there in the community that we've got to protect our borders, and we need to do something strong and decisive with it. Yeah, no, but I disagree with it. As Summer said, it's only 7% of the immigration, and I think we can deal with them more humanely, process them while they're living within the community. I think it's a sensible way to go about it.
We've got a gentleman with his hand up the back there. I was going to take that question quickly.
Tony, I get very annoyed when I hear this continual wording of boat people and immigrants coming in. Personally, I believe they're illegal immigrants. There is a legal way to get into this country, and there is an illegal way. These people are coming in illegally.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment. And we have
here. Thank you.
We have another person with their hand up down the front here. We'll come to you in a moment. Kevin Sheedy, your response to what you're listening to.
Look, I think that when you look at the country we've got and you want to look forward 25 to 50 years, we're underpopulated, to be quite honest. I think we need to look at ourselves in the position we are in the world. We're a very fortunate country. I think we need probably in the next... We've grown too slowly. As a teenager, we had 10 million people when I was a teenager. Now we have 21. That's too slow. We've got the resources to build our country and bring in quite a number of people. America in 1900 to 1910 brought in 10 million people. We couldn't possibly think of doing something like that. So if we want to be a great country in the future, we need to have a lot better immigration policy.
Can I just pick up the point? Everyone's talking about asylum seekers. And are you concerned at all?
If they're justified and they're going to be possibly killed, possibly their lives are saved, I think we've got to look at issues like that. I think we need to sit down and review all the policies over the next 12 months and get it done. We're too slow.
OK, we've got a person with their hand up there. I'll just take you.
Given that 97% of all asylum seekers who come to Australia by boat are found to be genuine refugees, can the government representatives and the opposition representatives please explain their rhetoric of border protection when we don't need protecting?
Yeah, OK. I'm going to just take that on notice because we actually have another question on the subject, and then I'm going to bring Scott Morrison in, and we have a question from Yang Lee.
Hi, Tony Abbott was quoted that currently, on average, every illegal boat arrival costs $82,000 to process, but by resurrecting the temporary protection visa and Pacific solution, each refugee case will need to be assessed twice, costing the Australian taxpayers an average of $500,000 per person. Furthermore, most of the refugees will retain their refugee status and be granted permanent residence following the second assessment. Moral arguments aside, how can the Liberal Party economically justify bringing back the controversial policies of the Howard years?
OK, 2 points you can pick up on. You want to start with the second question, if
I'll
you can.
go to my constituent first, because that's where you should always start. Look, there is nothing compassionate about a policy that encourages people to get on boats. And that is what we've seen over the last 2 years. We've seen 133 boats arrive, 6,200 people get on those boats. When the Coalition left office, there were 21 children being detained in detention centres around the country. Today, there are 427 children being detained. There is nothing compassionate about giving people smugglers a product to sell to people. And that's what permanent residency does as far as offering those to those who have come. And I will say that illegally because the UN Convention recognises that if you come without a valid visa, that is an illegal entry. There's nothing illegal about seeking asylum, but there is something illegal about entering without a valid visa. And what our policy does is seeks to distinguish on only one term, and that is whether someone has applied for asylum and refugee status and to come to Australia offshore, so in a refugee camp like the 9,000 the Howard government brought from the camps in Thailand on the Burmese border, as opposed to those who've paid a people smuggler and come by boat. Now, our policy is very clear on this. We've always walked one side of the street on this. The government has been on every side of the street and taken a good trip around the nature strips as well on this issue. They have literally been all over the shop. At least with the Coalition, you know where we stand. I think it's a compassionate thing to do to try and stop people getting on boats. We have 3,500 people in detention. They're reopening the Curtin detention centre that we closed. If you stop the boats, you stop children getting on boats, you stop people in detention, and no one is being processed over any period of time because they're not here.
Scott Morrison, can I just get you to address the question that was asked, suggesting that the cost of the cost of keeping people in your system would be vastly higher?
Well, I'd say the contrary. The government has introduced on the 9th of April a system whereby they're freezing discriminatorily applications for assessment from Sri Lanka and Afghanistan. Now, their own budget shows they'll have $1 billion blowout over the next few years, and in estimates it was revealed one of the reasons for that is under their policy people will be spending longer in detention. Under our policy, what would be happening with those from Afghanistan and Sri Lanka at the moment? Their claims would be assessed now, They would be offered, if they were found to be a legitimate refugee, a temporary protection visa in Australia, and they'd be out of detention and they'd be in the community. That's what we're proposing, and we think that is a far more fair system of dealing with this than the way the government has proposed to just arbitrarily freeze applications. And since they did that, 27 boats have arrived and 1,200 people or thereabouts.
All right. Let's hear from Kevin Sheedy, and then I'll go to...
Just a point that happened in my life when I grew up as a kid. I saw a lot of refugees come in from after the war years, beautiful Italian people and German people who we were at war with. They've helped build our nation. We've had, obviously, the Snowy Mountain Scheme. We need to actually plan ahead what our population should be, bring them in, a lot of people to this country to help build the next Australia. Let's get on with it. That's all I'm doing.
Chris Bowen.
I actually think some important points have been raised, and some of which I agree. Now, it's important, as emotive and as emotional as this debate is and can get, that we have it based in facts. Now, the fact is that under the Howard government, 13,000 refugees came into Australia each year. Under the Rudd government, 13,000 refugees are coming into Australia each year. That's the fact. And a debate around this on facts is not helped, frankly, by Scott's scaremongering ads with great arrows of yellow hordes coming into Australia, which verge on Islamophobia, and you are not able to have a rational debate when you've got that sort of cheap politicking going on. But we need to get back to that rational debate. Another fact is that refugees, when they come to Australia, frankly, do it tough. I mean, the idea that we should be, as Scott's policy is, saying to refugees, you've got to get straight into the workforce, we don't care if you speak English or not, we don't care what training you need, we don't care what trauma you've been through. The fact is at the moment that refugees go through training and have work requirements and training requirements. And, you know, we've all seen the emails saying that refugees get a better deal than aged pensioners, all of which we know is not true. But we need to get this debate back to facts and have a calm, rational discussion about it. And it's not helped when you've got the sort of campaign that Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison are running.
OK, I want to hear from Summer-headed... Chris Bowen just said the Liberal Party advertisement, Tony Abbott's advertisements, amounted to Islamophobia. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think, you know, the entire framing of this issue is negative. I mean, when we think about refugees, we automatically think about illegal boat arrivals, and that's because of the language that has been used in this debate. It doesn't help. I mean, we're here in Western Sydney. We have a high settlement of refugee communities here who have contributed successfully to the economic, social and cultural development of this region, but also New South Wales as well. But rarely is that story being painted in the grand narrative. And I think when you're saying that, you know, we should have a rational debate about this issue, what is rational about this blanket ban on Afghan and Sri Lankan nationals? What's rational about turning people away when you know that when they go back to their countries, they will face persecution? Well, I mean, surely there's a moral imperative here. We have troops in Afghanistan. We have a military involvement in Afghanistan. Surely we should be increasing our intake.
Of course there's a moral imperative, and we're not turning people away. And frankly, if you think that, you've got the policy wrong.
Well, you're freezing their applications, refusing to process them and keeping them in detention.
Well, indefinite.
Well, with respect, it is indefinitely if you can't tell them when they're going to get out.
No, but if we're having a debate based around facts, we are not turning them away, we're not sending them back. What we're saying is we need some time to assess the political situation in Sri Lanka and Afghanistan. And we'll do that, and we think that's the rational and calm thing to do. It's not about turning boats away, and Scott said, oh, since they did that, the boats have kept coming. We never said it was about stopping the boats coming. We said it was about dealing with the complex issues in Afghanistan and Sri Lanka in as calm and sensible way as is possible. I understand some people will disagree with that on both ends of the spectrum. But that's the best balance that we have been able to reach.
OK, a quick one from Prugo. You have to move on.
Yep, and the same generation as Kevin, I grew up with a generation of refugees who made and continue to make a fantastic contribution to Australia. To me, the issue is fairness. 13,000, whether it's on boats or wherever they're coming from, there's a 13,000 quota on refugees. Every person that gets off a boat and is allowed here means somebody else lives in a camp on some border somewhere for another year.
That's right.
And that is terribly unfair.
That's right.
OK. This is Q&A, where you ask the questions. If you want to ask a question yourself, go to our website and register to be part of the audience, just like these people did. Our next question comes from Amir Dedic.
Being a young Muslim myself, I would just like to ask what the Australian Council of Islamic Council of Australia is doing to integrate young Muslims into the Australian society, and when are Muslims going to stop feel like they're being constantly discriminated against?
There is a serious issue of discrimination that young Muslims and young Australian Muslims in this country are facing. There is a sense of alienation from mainstream communities, and it doesn't help when you're being called a delinquent who's vulnerable to radicalisation. I mean, if you want to integrate Muslims, firstly, let's change the language around how you approach young Muslims in particular. But the issue of integration, I think, is one that is best manifested in community-driven initiatives. I mean, I don't expect much from the government on this front, and I think that the most successful initiatives that we've seen, particularly in Western Sydney, has been around community cultural development, giving organisations the funding and the resources to work directly with young Muslims. I think is the best way to go about this issue. But I think if we're going to move forward as a country, we need to think more broadly about other minority groups as well. It's not just young Muslims who are facing marginalisation, it's also young Indigenous Australians as well.
Can we go back to our questioner and just want to ask you this. Do you think, is it a two-sided coin? I mean, do you accept the part of the issue is related to the community itself, your own community?
Well, to be honest, I mean, there's this constant issue of Muslims being discriminated against in this country, but being Muslim myself, I've never really felt like that. But you constantly in the media hear, how there's discrimination happening, but I really can't sense it in everyday, day-to-day life. And I just think it's something that's hyped up more than what it really is.
Kevin.
I think that some of the areas that we connect with in this country, Australia, are sport, music, theatre and books. They're four of the main connectors in Australia. And what we've tried to do at the AFL is connect particularly with our Indigenous Australians. We nearly have 100 Indigenous Australians on the AFL list. We've just drafted 2 extra for Greater Western Sydney this week. So if you actually get into our communities and work through sport, it's like a vine, it actually grows through your community, you actually can get really exciting people working together. It does not matter what religion or what nation they've come from. And I've seen it with a supportive basis. We've done marvellously well with that. And we're out here in West Sydney, we're working through some of the schools now, particularly in intensive English programs. And of course, and the AFL's been working with that, say, for about 8 years now. And this new team is going to hopefully build a lot of relationships, because I really believe, like most Australians, when you sit down and watch tennis or cricket or golf or any code, Socceroos coming up, it connects Australia. So let's keep
Let me stop you there, because we do actually have a question on this topic, and it comes from Will Matthews. Question specifically for you.
Thanks. Kevin Sheedy, why do you think the AFL is a more positive force for social change than NRL?
I think we've taken it on board. I think we know that we have a possibility here to connect the whole of Australia through sport and through a game that obviously through in the southern states has done very, very well. I mean, clubs have got 40 and 50,000 members in their clubs, which is quite remarkable. And we know not many sporting clubs of a professional era would have that many members. And half of those memberships are women in AFL that follow the game. So it's a great connector. We are working hard. That's why we've come here. I think personally, the AFL, we've taken too long to get here. But I think in the end, as we move into New South Wales, where there's about 8 million people, and into Queensland, we'll be able to connect the whole of Australia up through the grassroots, through our Auskick programs. And that's probably our greatest strength, the people of Australia gradually starting to love it, our own Australian game.
Scott Morrison, you're from rugby league territory. You feeling threatened?
No, I'm not. But I pick up Kevin's point, and this sport is a great way to, I think, to engage. And I mentioned the Kokoda initiative before, and that was done through Surf Lifesaving and the Lakemba Sports Club. And next time round, we're doing it through the local Shire football clubs, soccer clubs on that occasion. And the level of female membership, particularly in participatory soccer and football in the Shire, is fantastic. And it provides the same opportunity for people to come around something they all enjoy and they love doing. And so we'll be off to Sandakan next year doing the same thing.
All right, we'll come back to that subject, I'm sure, but we have a question getting back to what we were talking about before from David Miskoff.
Regardless of religion or heritage, do you think it is harder for immigrants to integrate because they are not wanting to be fully Australian? Which begs the question, why did they choose to come here in the first place?
Summerhead, would you like to take that up first?
Can I pose it to David? What's fully Australian?
That is exciting.
I would
That
really
is
like
so
to know.
exciting. I mean, can I put you in my team? I mean, we've got you in the half-back flank next week.
It is a good point. Would you like to explain what you mean by fully Australian?
We have come to become our own unique cultural way of life. We have a sense of what we call that.
Well, yeah, look, I take it. It's
no,
hard
look,
to articulate.
I'm first-generation Australian. My parents came here wanting a different way of life from what they had over there. And I don't call myself Yugoslav, I don't call myself Serbian, I call myself Australian. But I've seen recently that first-generation, second-generation people still call themselves from wherever their parents originally came from. And I just think that the concept of wanting to become Australian is not there anymore.
Are we having a coded discussion here about Islam? I suppose that's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves. I mean...
I'm not sure. Is it a coded question about Islam?
I said regardless of heritage or
fair
religion.
enough.
I mean, you pointed the fact that your parents came to Australia because they wanted a different way of life. They wanted a better way of life. I'd say that's the same for my parents too. They came to this country because, yes, it's the land of opportunity, and it has been the land of opportunity. But I think what's so unique about Australia is its demographic, the fact that we have a diversity here. That's what's great about Australia, and I don't think we should shy away from that whatsoever.
But we also have great values. We're strong believers in democracy and in the rule of law and everybody having the same access to that law. We have a very open approach to people. We're known for our laughter and our tolerance of other people, and I think that they are great qualities for a country to have that transcend sport. And are about being Australian. Our national costume is T-shirt and thongs. What could be easier for everybody to have? And I think it's a myth to suggest that people come here to just be what they were. They come here to share the values, not just the opportunities. Sana.
Let's hear from Scott Morrison. Integration, is that a word that you would adopt as part of your policy?
Look, I think whatever word you want to call it, when Jessica Watson came into Sydney Harbour the other week, Australians spontaneously celebrated that event, and it didn't matter whether you're wearing a hijab, if you're wearing, thongs and a T-shirt or whatever it was, or your pyjamas. It didn't matter. People celebrated, I think, the values that were inherent in that moment. Courage, determination, all of these things that Jess, I think, said to us all, we could all identify with. And I think those Australian values are accessible. I don't think they're exclusive. I think for whatever culture or heritage you can come from, you can celebrate that heritage, but you embrace those values. And that's the feedback I get. It's something I strongly believe in, and I think that's what resonated on that day.
Wow. I think one of the problems is that in this debate, we're always focusing on what's different and not what's the same. We're always focusing on our differences, not our similarities. I mean, I grew up in Parramatta and went to school at Macquarie Boys High School, and that was a diverse school. And I now have friends who are from a Lebanese background, from an Asian background, and frankly, I hardly ever think of them in terms of who they are nationalist, like what their background is. I think of them as people, and I think as my friends. And that's because we've lived together, we've lived life together. And I don't see those differences. We have differences like I do with any of my friends. That's it. Right. And I think that Australia, if it can continue on this, continue accepting immigrants and continue ensuring that they live together and experience life together, that Australia stands on the precipice of being able to be a leader in the world, of showing that we're becoming more a world of human people and not people who are just restrained by the identity of borders.
Yes. Well, I think Heath just put it very eloquently, frankly. And like Heath, I grew up in Fairfield, just north of here, still live there, one of the most multicultural populations in the country. And it's a wonderful place to live, simply because you get that cross-section of cultures, which is all within the Australian culture. But I think it's great that, you know, when our kids...
Do you sense any threats to that harmony?
No, no, I don't. I think it's impossible to grow up where I grew up and where our kids grow up in Fairfield and be a racist, because you grow up, as he said, with people from around the world, from preschool on, and they are just people. They're just your playmates and your schoolmates, and you learn to see the best in people. So for where I'm from, the most multicultural part of Australia, no, I don't see any risks. I mean, because we all just get along. Because if you don't get along, then society's going to fall apart pretty quickly. And everybody in my community knows that.
I just want to come back to Samara, and the same question, do you feel any threats to that harmony?
Living in Western Sydney, absolutely not. Like mentioned, it is a multicultural region. But I was in the Northern Territory a few weeks ago, and you know, I was speaking to young Indigenous Australians, and they felt that there is no harmony in their communities, and living within the mainstream community as well. They felt as though there is a sense of racism. So it may not be an issue for us out here in our chameleon nation, but it is an issue. And I think if we are ever going to move forward as a nation, if we are ever going to adopt this culture in which you've espoused, we need to seriously think about racism and the presence of racism in our society.
All right, I'm just going to go to this gentleman down the front who's patiently had his hand up for a while, right down the front here in the second row, third row.
What a lot of people don't realise, it doesn't matter where you come from, it's always home. Now, I come from a little place just outside of Wagga called Currawarna, and you still call that place home. I've now been living in Sydney for sort of 50 years or so, but it's still in your mind that that's where you come from.
Okay, we will take that as a comment. Thank you, sir. And we have another question up the back. It's from Lance Westerberg.
This is for Kevin Sheedy. Why has the AFL decided to pay Israel Folau $4 million instead of investing the $4 million on juniors in the western area and southwestern Sydney area? Or is this just is it just a ploy to weaken the other codes?
No, I think, look, it's a very good question, to be quite honest. You know, we actually are looking at developing players from other codes, not just about Israel Folau. We've actually got about 20 players from other codes playing in the AFL at the present time that we've recruited from basketball, we've recruited from hurling in Ireland, obviously Gaelic footy also. So when you look, I mean, David Hill, who's a ruckman at Essendon, he played volleyball. So we've been doing that for quite a number of years, actually. But when you pick up a young, talented player like Israel Folau, everybody feels that, oh, this is not on. I mean, to be quite honest, most of the components of his contract will be about marketing and obviously ag campaigns. It wasn't that long ago the AFL paid elite athletes from overseas to do a series called I'd Like to See That. And here we are paying international athletes from other countries, yet we want to pay a young Australian boy who's been excellent and a fantastic rugby league player. As soon as we want to do that with one or two players from other codes, everybody jumps up and down. I mean, from my point of view, this young man's had the courage to say, look, I've done my best, I've been hopefully he thinks he's been fantastic at league, and yet here we are, he's had the courage to try out another sport. And from that point of view, you have to pay for that sort of courage because you're giving up a hell of a lot and taking a risk. The AFL actually are spending millions of dollars. We're going to actually come into Western Sydney And we're going to invest over $200 million in Greater Western Sydney. I mean, that's a fantastic contribution to the communities for employment. We'll work through harmony and, of course, education. We've opened up also, say, for example, the AFL traineeship program, which we've had for 18 years. We've employed over 7,000 kids on traineeship programs. And every year, 750 kids get a job through the AFL, and 150 of those are Indigenous Australians from all over Australia. So we're a well-planned organisation, and we really work hard in the grassroots through Auskick, and we're going to develop this right through the Greater Western Sydney.
You said, Kevin, it's a risk for Israel Folau.
Well, it is.
Yeah, is it? Because, I mean, yes, exactly. Because what happens if he can catch, which we know he can do, but he can't kick?
Well, it's quite amazing. You know, I read an article recently that he's only had sort of 10 or 20 kicks in his career. And I thought to myself, well, that's a fantastic article because they don't kick in rugby league. So I just sort of laughed at that headline. I mean, he might be one of the greatest kicks you've ever seen, but you don't know that because you haven't seen it.
Well,
so we'll take that
risk.
risk.
You're paying him $4 million to find out.
Well, we'll take it. Well, he's actually produced $4 million worth of advertisements already.
All right, okay.
But I mean,
he's probably produced 10 million.
What sort of message are you sending, though, to those AFL players who have committed their lives to this code and are low paid as well?
Well, he'll be paid about $250,000 as a footballer. Okay, so and that's the basic wage of an average wage of an AFL player. As a matter of fact, one of the great things about what we've been able to do right across the board is that we actually spend $120 million for players to play. That's the salary cap of the AFL. We actually employ thousands of people right around the whole nation. About 13,000 people are employed in the AFL. So it's an enormous industry.
Gentleman up here has his hand up very patiently.
First of all, you pay me $6 million. I'm a very courageous person.
Let me look at you.
No, I'm not. And look, the point is, I'm not built like Israel Folau. All I'll say is, and this is an honest point.
Yeah.
Players like Wendell Saylor, Matt Rogers, Lottie Takiri, they switch codes for the money. Let's not lie, but they all end up back in rugby league. What makes you think Israel Folau is going to be any different? Does his time? I think it's $6 million, takes his $6 million check for after four years and just pisses off back to rugby league.
Indeed. Would it matter after 4 years? Probably not.
If it's $4 million, you lose half anyway. And first of all, it's because we give it to the Liberals or the Labor.
He's not a mining company, mate.
And then in the end, if he gets married, then he doesn't get any. So, no, in seriousness...
all I'm saying is, have you seen him kick the ball?
The whole point here is we worry about what a player gets paid, yet we never ever discuss how much a golfer or a tennis player gets paid. And it's quite amazing.
Before I throw this to the panellists, the question just came up, have you seen him kick the ball?
Yes, I have. I've actually had a kick with him.
Okay.
And he can kick it pretty well. And he actually can mark it. And what I'm really excited about is I'm going to coach him. And he might get better. I've got to back myself in.
Let's hear from Heath Ducker.
Just the question in my mind is, are you trying to buy off Western Sydney?
Western Sydney?
Yeah. With
no. I mean, obviously, when you look at what... We've been in Western Sydney for 8 years. That's what a lot of people don't realise. The grounds that are built out there, there's the size of the MCG. We work with governments, both state governments, local, and obviously federal government, for 8 years to build the stadiums that are out there. We're going to come back in and hopefully help reignite Homebush and play our home games there. And from a point of view, you know, when you think about it, probably in the last 10 years since the Olympic Games, which I thought was just Sydney's greatest advertisement for this nation as a city, absolutely fantastic. Probably believe we need an injection here in Sydney. And maybe some sports like the soccer Rovers that are coming out to the West too, and the AFL might be one of the injections out west, and that's what we're intending to do.
Let's see, we're nearly out of time. Chris Bone.
I just briefly want to come to the AFL's defence because they have done, frankly, a fantastic job at community development and the development of young players. And I know Israel Folau will get all the publicity, and that's the way they designed it. But they do a magnificent job all through the communities in developing young footballers, and they haven't come in and said, we've got a football model that we're going to impose from the top. They've built it up from the ground up. And there's 1.8 million people in Western Sydney, which is more than South Australia, which supports 2 AFL teams. I reckon we can get one very good AFL team, and it's very strong already in local communities, AFL, which not many people realise, but there's lots of teams out there playing every Saturday and enjoying their footy, and I think the AFL are doing a first-class job.
I think that's prepared to give up on the NRL?
I don't mind admitting that I think AFL is a great game, and it's a game that Western Sydney, I think, will embrace.
All right, Scott Morrison, we're nearly out of time.
Participation in sport is the key thing, whether it's AFL, whether it's football, whether it's rugby union or whatever it is, female, male. Participation and all the people who get out there every weekend, the people who put out the nets and all the rest of it, they're the ones who need the support, and I know that AFL does do that in their code. I know football does it in their code, and I think we've got to encourage all of our codes to invest in that grassroots participation, because otherwise you look a bit more like me and Joe Hockey.
And as long as you remember that community development's more than sport, and we've got a long way to go in Western Sydney making sure that we give people the proper services and engagement that they deserve.
And here we are in an arts centre talking about AFL, rugby league, etc., etc. But we are in an arts centre. Let's remind ourselves we have run out of time. There's so much more to say. There always is. Please thank our panel: Scott Morrison, Kevin Sheedy, Summer Hadid, Heath Ducker, Prue Gowd and Chris Bowen. And a very special thanks to the Casula Powerhouse Arts Centre and the people of southwestern Sydney for hosting this edition of Q&A. Next week, the Australian philosopher and author of Animal Liberation and Practical Ethics, Peter Singer, the Minister for Environmental Protection, as they now call him, Peter Garrett, the former Communications Minister, Helen Coonan, the journalist David Marr, whose latest essay claims that anger drives Kevin Rudd. So join us next Monday when we talk about animal rights, human rights, and the rights and wrongs of Kevin Rudd. Good night.